Welcome to the Wheelhouse live workshop. I believe this is our third workshop. Yep, we did one on segments. I'm forgetting what the other, dynamic sets. And then today we're doing on just revenue management basics. So really excited to get into things. Just an intro for myself. I'm the head of onboarding at Wheelhouse and a revenue manager. I've been doing revenue management for about 7 years now. And I got my start back in the day with a company called Stay Alfred, managed multiple markets with them, and then did RM consulting for a bit as well. And I'll pass it over to John to intro himself as well.
Pleasure to meet all you guys. My name is John DiRolay. I'm the head of revenue management education. Been with Wheelhouse about 4 years. If you're working with us, you may have talked to me or seen me on some of our other productions. Prior to joining Wheelhouse, I was revenue management consultant, and before that, I worked with a company as a revenue manager for 10 years. It was actually also Stay Alfred. Keegan was on my team, and we got to kind of build that whole revenue management function up together as that company grew from 100 to 3,000 units. So lots of experience, get to talk to a lot of folks around the country and around the world, and just love trying to help people make more money with their properties.
Awesome. All right, so here's the agenda for today. We're going to start with some just RM to-dos. These are kind of just nice lists of things to do, just general, checkoffs throughout the week, and could be a good cadence to do, once to couple times a week. You'll see when we get into that. Then we'll actually get more specific into an individual listing analysis, specifically going into a listing on Wheelhouse, and what data points to look at, understanding your pricing, and having that conversation as well. And then the next part, we'll be getting into portfolio level analysis, so how you can use some charting tools as well as the calendar to make adjustments. Identify places you need to make adjustments and then make them. So, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. After each demo, we'll be having the slide deck, but then we'll actually jump from the slide deck into our portfolios. So John and I will be jumping back and forth. After those demos, we'll open it up for questions, so you can ask those at that time. But feel free in the chat to ask questions at any point when they come up as we're doing something. That way we can get to them when we open up for questions.
Yep, and if you want to speak your question out loud, once we get to that end of the demo, we'll let you know, and then you can raise your hand, and you can turn off your mic and ask us the question. We can chat about it a little bit. These revenue management kind of processes we thought are really helpful for just setting a baseline or a foundation of things to do as a revenue management practice. It is not a comprehensive list, and we're kind of in a way going to scratch the surface, but we hope that you take away a few things that you can do that will help you in your revenue management process. All right, Keegan.
Yeah, let's get into it. So RM to-dos. We're going to start on the left side here with new booking analysis and reservation list. I'm actually going to have John tackle this section, and then I'll go to the next one.
Why don't we read through this and then we'll just do the demo. So the three here we've got are new booking analysis, expiring inventory, and sorting and reporting. These are three things that no matter how sophisticated you are, you can probably start doing now. And you can really do these in a number of different places. These aren't just Wheelhouse specific things. Some of these may also seem like really obvious, but I'm going to let you know they are revenue management processes, and they do make a good foundation if you're really just trying to find like one or two things that you can implement in your limited time to basically start improving your revenue. So I'll start off with this first one, then I'll pass back to Keegan, the new booking analysis and a reservation list. Let me see here. It's asking me a question. This is going to be, can you guys see my screen? Did it switch over?
No, I'll stop sharing so it'll give it to you.
Okay.
Boom.
Okay. And you see the performance page?
I do.
Perfect. So new reservation analysis, super basic. I bet as you've been starting your companies or you were working as a host or you joined, you look at your reservations every day and you never thought to yourself, that's a revenue management process. Frankly, it is, because revenue management is all about monitoring your revenue, finding opportunities to improve. And the new reservation check is something I would usually advise that people do at least once a week. As you get more sophisticated tools, you may kind of cover this ground, but it's a great place to just start out for revenue management. You can pull these reservation lists from a number of places. Out of your PMS, if you're booking directly on channels, you can pull it from there and combine them. If you're using Wheelhouse, you can obviously pull a reservation list here. And the goal is just to look at your reservations that have been made recently and do a few things. So let me start out with where we are in Wheelhouse if you wanted to do this. I'm on this performance page up here. Let me see if I can give myself a drawing implement. So we're going to be up on this performance page up here. And we'll come back to some of these charts because they're super great. But right now, we're just going to scroll all the way to the bottom. And what we have here is a list of reservations. This list of reservations is going to be dynamic. So if you change your filters, if you adjust your dates, you will get this adjustment here. And the main activity here is really just to check the recent reservations, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure this is sorted by reservation date so that I have the most recent reservations up here. And the first thing I like to do is check the reservations from really the last week. This is something that you could do once a week off. It's such a short process though, you could almost do it every day. So if you're doing it every day, check the reservations from the last day. And what we're really trying to do is just do a gut check. You guys have intuition. A lot of revenue managers operate off of intuition. You have an idea of how much money you should be making in different seasons, what your high season is. And the goal here is just to check, hey, what dates am I booking in? And does my ADR look pretty good, right? We want to make sure that there's no mistakes in the pricing, that we're not seeing some unusual activity where we're accidentally booking it too, too low. And we also want to check to see if we're booking in time periods we would expect. So if I'm looking at these reservations over the last day, this is pretty in the short term, this is in the short term. I'm in low season in these markets, then this kind of makes sense that I would be filling in the low term. You'll also want to look out for bookings that are pretty far in advance. I don't have any on this list right now, but as you see reservations that come in super far in advance, that's the best opportunity to check when ADRs are where they are. Because if you're looking at reservations that come in super early and you're like, hey, that maybe seems a little low for what I'm expecting, it's telling you to go and look at that listing and maybe make some adjustments, right? You can also monitor the other end, especially if you're first using a revenue management system. Sometimes people are surprised by high reservations. If you're just learning kind of how things work, always a good idea just to check. So the goal here is just look for anomalies, check them at the listing level or check them at the group level. Now, there's one other thing that I like to look at when I do this reservation analysis, and it's just to get an idea of pace. So you can see we made 2 reservations yesterday. We made quite a few the day before, right? And if I go to the next page, I was making quite a few on the 16th. So that to me is kind of interesting. Basically, if I'm thinking about how many reservations I'm making per day, most of the time I'm making over like 6 to 10 here. And then suddenly yesterday, I only made 2. That change in behavior is telling me that maybe something is wrong that I need to look at. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this. And really the goal of this activity is just to tell you to go look or to go investigate a hunch. It could be totally reasonable. Maybe I'm fully booked up now. I don't know yet in this activity. Maybe we know that it's almost Christmas, so booking's going to die down. Maybe I blocked a bunch of units. I don't know. But taking into account changes in how many reservations you're making per day is another good way to say, hey, do I actually need to invest more time this week in this activity? Awesome. Keegan?
Yeah. So let me reshare here. And something that can be related to looking at that. Let me open the slideshow here. Looking at the reservations list and specifically what John was talking about with pacing is expiring inventory, right? So when we talk about expiring inventory, typically we're talking about short-term window from today. So the next 7, 14, even up to 60 days. This expiring window for your portfolio and listings can vary by market or even property type, right? So if you're in more of an urban, like downtown market with, condos, studios and one beds, um, you may have a much different ability to sell within the short term than a 5 bedroom in like an urban location, right? So that expiring window, or sorry, expiring inventory window can vary, but essentially it's looking at the near term rate positions and restriction positions and just making sure you're trending towards a sellout and putting your best foot forward during that time, because once a date passes, obviously it is unsellable, and ideally we would have sold at maybe a slightly lower rate than just letting a high rate sit there and pass by, right? And so this, like when I'm talking about the relation to what John was mentioning with pacing, is if I go in and do this practice, which we'll see in a second, I'll do a live demo. In the short term, I would hope to expect to see a lot of reservations coming in on that reservation list for the period that I made adjustments on. So I'll go ahead and open up the portfolio calendar on Wheelhouse. But again, similar to what John was mentioning with the reservations list, this isn't like a Wheelhouse specific revenue management practice. You can do this on really any calendar. You can do it in your PMS or any other RMS calendar as well. So we are starting at, let me pull up my writing instrument, the portfolio calendar in Wheelhouse. And this is a good calendar to pull up listings in bulk. So right now I have my property Shroot Farms pulled up, 4 listings, all in the same location. And so this calendar is really great for coming in and seeing all of them together and making quick adjustments. A couple things to really look out for in this expiring window. For one, are my minimums too high? That's definitely a common occurrence. The minimums could be set high for a number of reasons, right? Could be an owner request. It could have been unintentional on my part, not really thinking about my low season minimums. Maybe I just set like a floor and I was thinking really about my high season, but I accidentally set it for the low and shoulder too. So in Wheelhouse, you'll notice some dates have this little asterisk next to them. That means I'm hitting my floor or my minimum price. In this case, I may opt to either go in as a setting and lower my minimum down, or I can, from this calendar here, which I'll show you in a minute, drop that floor as well. So looking out for too high of minimums. Another one could be if I've set fixed or static rates. If I've gone in and intervened on the calendar in the past and I forgot that I sent a fixed rate, Wheelhouse in this case does not have the ability to drop that in the last minute. So I might need to remove any of those fixed rates I've put in place. So understanding your rate position basically is very important. If there's any premiums, of course, you can see I have a couple days that I've put like percentage increases on. I may opt to remove those in the short term and really put my best foot forward, like I said, to hopefully sell those dates. So understanding rate positions via minimums, fixed rates, or even premiums with percentages is important. And then another thing to look for is restrictions, right? So for this property, I have a 4-night minimum. You can see in the top left of each cell that my minimum length of stay requirement is 4 nights. I may want to reconsider my strategy in the low season and drop that minimum. I can do that via rules, which can do this on a time-based cadence, or I can just intervene myself as well. So not just rate position, but also your availability restrictions as well need to be considered in the expiring inventory. I like to think of it as like casting a wider net, right? So if I drop the length of stay for these dates from 4 to 3 nights, I have much more booking options for guests out there than obviously just setting it to 4 or higher. So what this could look like here, in this case, I have some listings where I set fixed rates and I want to go ahead and remove those because those are pretty high. So in this case on Wheelhouse, I can just click and drag for these 2 listings. The fixed rates are denoted by the yellow pricing and then the little F here. In this case, I'm just going to enter in a percentage adjustment as 0 and just save it. That effectively just removes those fixed rates that are kind of stale and not booking. So now I've done that. If I reassess now, I now can see, okay, without those fixed rates, I'm still hitting my minimums. I might opt to see what size these properties are. Well, they are one bedrooms. Going back to John's intuition comment earlier, I know this property well, I know the market well enough. In the short term for this week, I just know Christmas isn't very strong on Fruit Farms and 185 is too high. So in this case, I want to opt to come in and bring those down. So on the portfolio calendar, you not only can change your rate increases and set fixed rates, but I can adjust minimum stays as well straight from the calendar. So in this case, these two listings have the same minimum of 185. This one's at 200. So I'm not going to just set a new one because they're different property types. I'm actually going to adjust these minimums down all by 15%. So it's a relative adjustment. It's really nice that I can just go in and adjust these down by percentage instead of changing them one by one. So I'm going to save this. It'll bring those minimum rates down. And now hopefully I've put my a better rate out there. I also will extend this time frame, right? So I'm looking in the next week, but again, the window of which you look at can matter a lot. If and also your own pacing, right? So you need to understand like your own portfolio's pacing to know how much you can like take off, right? So if I'm, for example, really booking well for New Year's Eve weekend, still, I may not opt to be as harsh with the rate decreases for that weekend as I am being for this next week. We'll get to this a bit more when John starts talking about the portfolio level analysis and how you can kind of look at your properties and understand that pacing. Um, but so that window, it matters based on the property type, the market, but also how is your portfolio pacing and booking, right, in the near term matters a lot. So, and in this case too, I'm actually going to drop the minimum length of stay straight from the calendar as well. I'm actually just going to set these all to a 3-night minimum instead of 4. The calendar's pretty open. Only one listing is booked for all of Christmas, and another is only booked for 2 nights. So I'm going to drop that down to see if I can push 4 bookings in that time period there. So other considerations here. Let me just get to my notes here. Sorry. Cool. Another thing you can do, so obviously just looking at the calendar can work, but let's say I'm not looking at just 4 properties. Let me remove this filter. If I'm looking at, once it loads here, let's see, 117 properties. It can be quite a bit to just scroll and kind of find these opportunities, right? It's a lot to look at, especially if I'm not just looking at this next week and I'm really considering the next 2 or 3 weeks as my window for the expiring inventory. It can be quite a bit. So what I would recommend is either filtering so you have a group of listings that are open and available to book, or using columns like this column I already have set here for occupancy to sort for their lowest occupied listings to the top so that you can actually look at the ones that if you make a change for rates or restrictions will benefit from it, right? They're available and open to book. Seems obvious, but if you're looking at a bunch of properties, it can kind of be a waste of time to look at listings like this that are fully booked for the next week to 2 weeks, right? So how I do that on Wheelhouse via filter. Your filter options in the top left on the portfolio pages are broken down in 4 sections. There's listing features, status, but the ones I'm really worried about are the future metrics. I want to pull up listings that are not well occupied coming up into the future. And again, my expiring window for this demonstration, I'm just going to do the next 2 weeks. So pretty short term. And I'm going to opt to only look at listings that are under 40% occupancy in this case. And once I filter, I will not be looking at 117 properties. I'm now looking at 57. So a larger set. And now you can see the calendar is much more open. There are some listings that are booked, but there's still, potential on these as well, right? I can start talking about things like gap nights, lowering length of stay between those, lowering price. That is another scenario that you'll want to start looking at, like trying to lower your length of stay in between reservations or lowering the premiums as well. You can do those things manually. I would also recommend looking into ways you can automate those things because it can be really hard to catch every 2-night or 1-night gap on your calendar and make sure you go and change it, right? So if you're finding yourself manually doing a lot of those things, I recommend looking for ways to automate length of stay or pricing adjustments. So filtering down and looking at a smaller subset will help narrow down your search if you have a larger portfolio. Awesome. So I think that's a good segue for you, John. I'll stop sharing so you can take over for sorting and reporting.
You have that one.
My bad. I have that one. That's a good segue for me.
But while you're pulling that up,
Yeah, I'll bring it
um,
back to this page.
just give us a little. Gonna give you a little recap. We've gone over two processes right now. New booking analysis, where the primary thing is you're basically making sure you're making as many bookings as you would expect. You're also checking that the bookings are coming in places you want and that you're not underbooking too far out. Expiring inventory, you're basically consistently checking the short term, which will be a little different for you. I would suggest just setting some heuristics by bedroom count, like 7 days for one bedrooms, 14 for two, 21 for three, or something like that. And your goal there is just to drop the rate to try to drive occupancy. I always try to remind people when you do this activity, don't worry too much about getting the ADR right. Chances are you're not going to guess it right. Just drop it and get the occupancy on the books. So whatever that time frame is the time frame where you're like, well, I don't really care what gets booked rate wise because I'm just trying to drive the occupancy. And that's going to make that activity really fast. It's not an activity you should spend a lot of time on, but it's very impactful, especially if you're not doing any revenue management practices now, because as you know, the difference between, one booking and a little higher ADR is much lower than the difference between vacancy and a low value booking, right? So that's two practices that you can kind of implement. They're pretty foundational. Keegan started to touch on the next one in terms of making expiring inventory easier, but I think he's going to go in a little deeper here for you.
Yeah. And just to go back to earlier, John mentioned something when he was talking about the reservations list, understanding your seasonality. Like we didn't really mention that today. That's pretty evergreen revenue management, right? Understanding the seasonality matters for expiring inventory as well, right? Because if I'm looking at the next 2 weeks in my high season versus low season, I may be way more aggressive with rate cuts in the low season than necessarily in the high, right? So there's that intuition that comes about too, right? It's maybe a difference of me setting an expiring inventory rate of $150 versus $90 in the low season, right? So that will come with time and understanding your portfolio and as well as the market. But the next section, which I started touching on with filters, is really sorting and reporting through your segments. So we're going to pull up the portfolio calendar again. We're going to walk through this time actually using the columns, which I mentioned one of them, but we'll look at a couple more. And then setting up the filters that I showed briefly, but also gonna show on Wheelhouse how you can save those if you're consistently using certain filters to look at your various segments within the portfolio. So I'll pull up that page again here. All right, so I mentioned, and again, I'm on portfolio calendar. I mentioned earlier this column here, adjusted occupancy. In Wheelhouse, if you want to edit let me pull up my pen here. If you want to edit your columns, you can do so in the top right with this little column button. So if I check this here, this just shows me what columns I have selected currently. So right now I'm showing bedrooms, name, nickname, tags. These are going to look familiar because the filter options are basically exactly the same, right? We have listing features here, we have listing status, and then we have the metrics sections at the bottom. So we have historical metrics and future metrics here. And there's a lot here. We're not going to go through all of these today. I'll give you a couple examples of easy ones to just start with. But I definitely recommend, looking at these and exploring what you think will be useful for your practices. But the first two I almost always recommend adding are probably the easiest, which are last booked and then some sort of adjusted occupancy column. So I've already added these. You can see I've checked them here. Last booked is very straightforward. This column literally just tells me the last time a listing was booked, right? So for example, this listing here was booked 8 days ago, 2 days ago, 22 days ago. What's nice is you can sort by these column headers. So if I left click on the last booked title here, it will sort the portfolio. And clearly I have some inactive listings because these were last booked over 1,300 days ago. But this is great because I now have this context of what listings are stale. But of course, context is key, right? So that's one reason I recommend at least adding an adjusted occupancy column. If a listing has not been booked for a while, it might just be because it's fully occupied coming up, right? Has a lot of bookings, could also be blocked, right? Those could be two very easy reasons. It could be that my rates are just far too high, my length of stay restrictions are too high, right? You're going to be using these to sort of guide where you need to take a look if there is a problem, and then make adjustments. So you might not always know the answer just from looking at these metrics together. But these are two easy ones to pair up, right? Last booked and adjusted occupancy. I can start using this to my advantage. Like this listing here, has not been booked for 22 days, only has 7% occupancy coming up. Okay, so maybe I need to take a look at that one very clearly, looking at some of this expiring inventory coming up. My minimum, I'm hitting it quite a bit. I put in a very high rate premium on this New Year's Eve weekend 10 months ago. So I've just kind of let that really high increase sit there. That's probably something I need to strip off and like actually address, right? So that can help me find that. Another example here is this listing hasn't been booked for about 20 days, but has fairly good occupancy in the next month, right? So maybe I'm not as concerned about that property. So that's a nice just kind of combo, two columns you could quickly start using. There are a lot more up here though. Another interesting one under the future metrics section is min price occurrence. This one can have various use cases. I like this in low season because if I, for example, look at the next 2 weeks and then sort by this, let me go the other way actually, sort the highest to lowest. Some of these are inactive, so let me scroll down a little bit. I can see in the next 2 weeks, basically 17 of my properties are hitting their minimums. And furthermore, I can use this occupancy column here to see that most of them, actually every single one of those listings is under 50% occupied in the next 30 days. So that could be an indicator that my minimums are too high, especially in my low season coming up. And I can go back and drop those minimums like we did earlier if I need to. But this is a really nice one to kind of key me in the low season. Like, okay, are my minimums too high and I'm just not selling, right? Am I not producing bookings? One last column I mentioned, like I said, there's a lot here, so I'm not going to go through them all. Um, but the other one, where is it at? Book nights in. So under the historical metrics, this book nights in column is pretty nice. It's a little confusing until I explain it. So book nights in the last 14 days. This doesn't mean the last 14 bookable dates. It's saying over the last 14 uh, rolling calendar days, how many bookings has this listing gotten anywhere in the future, right? So for example, this listing here says 12 book nights in the last 14 days. That's not saying 12 of the last 14 days were booked. It's saying anywhere on the calendar in the future in the last 2 weeks has been booked 12 times, right? So this could be in my high season further out. It could be in the short term, right? But basically, this tells me sort of the production of a listing and how much activity has it had, right? So this is a nice one to quickly assess especially as you're approaching your booking window for like high season, like which listings are being actively booked and, securing those reservations leading into my high season. For those that are booking a lot, you may want to look and see where they're booking. Are there any, opportunities to increase rate for those properties because they are producing quite a few bookings? On the other end, are any of your listings not booking well at all? Like if I resort from bottom down, like maybe I need to look again at the minimum price or any premiums I put in place. So book nights in is a nice just key column to like understand the production of your listings. It could be also from a setting perspective, if a listing is booking quite a bit over like the last month, 2 months, it could be an indicator that you just need to bring up that base price because the base price can increase rates across the calendar. And if that listing has a good spread of bookings and is not just isolated to one time period, it's popular kind of all year round, could be a good indicator to raise that foundation up. So those are the columns. Just a note for product wise, if you want to save how your columns are, maybe I like these four, then what I would do is in the top right would click this little settings wheel here and then just save as my default column set so that those are always there when I log in. Additionally, filters are going to be pretty similar, right? So the UI is going to be the same. Again, listing features, listing status, historical metrics, future metrics. And you've already seen me start to use these filters a bit, but I can start doing a similar process, right? So for example, I can use min price occurrence just like I did with the column as a filter. And I could say in the next 14 days, I want to see listings that are hitting their minimum at least half of those days. So 7 to 14 times in the next 2 weeks. What's great about using the filters is one, you've already seen it kind of strips off any properties that I don't really want to look at, but I can save these as a segment. So next time I come back to this page, I don't need to like re-click all of the filters and reselect these. So in the top right, I'm going to draw again, there is this segments drop down here. We've already had a workshop on this, so I won't go too in depth on this. You can check that out on YouTube. But basically, I would go into segments and I would save. I have a bunch here already, but I would just save this as my new segment and maybe call it like min price occurrence and adjusted occupancy, right? And then this is great because now I have that segment within my portfolio, and I might use this mainly in the low season, but it's there and available for me when I get to the low season. Great. Let me move along here. So that was the end of that first RM to do section. Let me make this big. Do we want to open it up for questions?
Yeah, let us know if you have any questions. If we don't see any in a minute or so, we'll move on. One thing to note is those first two processes are just things that you can do. The third one does require some planning. So you can use those segments or columns to streamline the expiring inventory. You can also think of things that would be a concern for you and set up the KPIs to filter to them, right? So a few examples would be maybe on a monthly basis, you want to check your lowest performing listings. You could set up a filter for the occupancy being the lowest over the last 90 days under a certain point and just always look at that list of listings. You could do one where, hey, how many am I, what are my highest booking listings so that I can kind of look at those. They're all about setting up triggers for you to take action. It doesn't really have you take the action itself. That action's either going to come in the form of adjusting on the calendar or doing what we're going to talk about next, which is doing a deep dive into a listing. But that third piece is a much bigger piece, much broader. We show you the kind of how-to, which is to set up these filters and columns, but it's up to you to kind of decide what are some use cases for it. That would be something that you could do on a regular basis that would improve your revenue. Okay, let's move on.
Do it. If there's questions, just send them in chat. So next, we're going to start looking more granularly at the individual listing level. And we're going to focus on three things here. So understanding your current asking rates and how those are positioned, comparing to other series. So comparing the current setup for a listing to various other metrics and series here. And then we're going to talk about adjusting pricing as necessary, right? So we're going to talk about some of the settings that you can implement and when you would implement certain levers, right? So understanding the theory behind the settings, but also knowing like when do I pull the lever to change the base price, or when would I opt to change seasonality, right? So there's always a right tool for the job when you're talking about adjusting pricing. We've already seen one with expiring inventory. I will opt to use the calendar to adjust pricing for expiring inventory versus base price. So we'll talk more about that from the individual listing level. So for current asking rates, we just want to understand the current rate position and then really look at the pricing curve and take note of the seasonality, so how it changes month by month, and then also any holiday or event pricing that we are aware of, or maybe not aware of. Maybe there's some pricing jumping out that you don't know what that event is, but through dynamic pricing, it shows up through the data, right? Comparing to other series, we'll be looking at last year's ADRs, comp set pricing, as well as market pricing. And then we'll really focus our settings to base price, seasonality, and demand sensitivity. So let me open up a listing here. So I am on an individual listing. Just to show you, if you're familiar with Wheelhouse, you probably already know this, but you can search really from anywhere to find the listing. But from the dashboard, for example, I could type in the listing name, just left click. By default, it takes me to the calendar, but I can hop over to settings. You can, of course, use a calendar to understand your pricing setup, but I highly recommend getting good at looking at the pricing chart. And in this case, the Wheelhouse in context chart is here. The reason being is I can see all 18 months that are open to sell, right? Whereas if I'm just looking at the calendar, I can scroll and see all of the months, but it's not the most elegant way to do that, right? I can't see everything on one screen. So I definitely recommend getting good at looking at a pricing chart like this. And just to give you a breakdown of what we're looking at here, solid pink, that is the current pricing setup for this listing. So this property is in Seattle. It's a 2-bed, 1-bath apartment. And I can see the current pricing setup in solid pink. The other series we're going to worry about for now, I'll add more later and mention what they are. But for now, solid green on this chart is booked for the upcoming dates. So we can see here, if I zoom in, just left clicking, dragging, I am booked for a pretty long stay, pretty much from the day after Christmas up until early January. So that's the solid green. Whereas dashed green is last year's bookings, right? So quite a bit of bookings there last year, especially into the spring and summer months. So those are the 3 series we're going to start with. And then we're going to talk about basically looking at current rate position. So looking at my current rate position, the first thing I want to look at is basically how things change season by season, right? So in Wheelhouse, I can, of course, just look at this line, but under seasonality, I actually do get a breakdown of what that curve looks like without the demand model bringing up those peaks for events and holidays and weekends and things like that. So I can kind of understand the seasonality for the listing in this market. This is in Seattle, so summer is really the high season. The rest of the year is pretty rough. It is more downtown, so I would expect New Year's to do pretty well here. We're not seeing that in the seasonality curve. We'll actually check that up above. But for now, just want to, analyze and see if I agree with how this curve looks for my expectations, my intuition of the market, right? And I've managed properties in Seattle, and this pretty much is in line with what I would expect. July, August have kind of flipped back and forth over the years as really the high months. So I expect those two to be kind of neck and neck. Early and late summer, or sorry, early summer and late summer here, early fall, I expect to be more shoulder season. Spring is pretty rough, maybe a couple events, but on the whole, this makes sense to me, right? And I can also see this just from the pricing chart above. I can see how here in the early winter, the rate position overall is fairly low when we're looking up into July and August. The overall median price there is definitely elevated. And so we can see that sort of shift overall come up. And then, of course, down into the fall, I can see how the slope of the median price there is coming down. And then the far future into winter, again, pretty low with the exception of some weekends here, right? So understanding that seasonality is important. But then I also want to take note of any specific date ranges, right? So this property, interestingly enough, if I zoom in on New Year's Eve, booked fairly high. My current rates are pretty low. That's probably because I've gone in and made some adjustments here. Or maybe this is out of the box um, for this listing. This is a hypothetical, so it may not make as much sense because I've done some weird setup here. But there is a mismatch here from what I'm currently doing to where I booked. So I probably had some sort of premium. The listing got booked. I've stripped the premium. If this reservation were to cancel, then my new rate would be here. Checking some other dates, things that jump out to me. Very clearly, I have a high rate position in the middle of July. I'm actually hitting a max price that I've set. So I would probably want to look into this. That's a really high rate. Is it something I did? Is the model bringing it up? Some unknown event. Maybe it's Taylor Swift. That's a pretty high peak there. Want to check that. And then some of these make sense, right? Like Labor Day here, I can clearly see a very high peak. We can see Memorial Day weekend, very high peak. So getting more granular to those holidays or local events is really important and understanding where you're currently at. Because you may be aware of these events, but you also may find something new, right? Like I don't know what this is in the middle of July, but apparently there's something going on. So I want to take note of that and probably set a reminder to check back and maybe make some adjustments right now. So I also would want some more context, right? So just looking at my current pricing is difficult, especially if I don't have a good intuition for the market or the listing. And the first line, which I already talked about, that can help with that is last year's ADRs, right? This can be a good gauge of current position and if I need to make any adjustments. Of course, things can change in the market year over year. We've all seen that if you've been in the industry. For a while. Of course, things can change, but it is at least a good gauge of where I'm currently at, right? And looking for big mismatches is going to be a good place to start. Very clearly, last year, I booked some low rates, right? We can see in this time period, if I zoom in, last year I booked under $200 even into June. My current rate position is pretty high, right? Now, again, this could be for a number of reasons. Maybe it was a newer property last year and I was needing to just lease it up, get turnkeys, get some good reviews. And now going into this year, I can be much more aggressive and command those higher rates. So that's definitely something that draws my attention. And then very quickly, my eyes are drawn over here because in the fall last year, I booked really, really, really well. But my current rate position is much, much lower. If I zoom in here, last year, ADRs were peaking at 900, almost $1,000 a night. My current rate position at the highest is over Labor Day weekend at $700, right? So this may be an area of opportunity. Maybe I'm not being aggressive enough. Maybe I want to start out here. Maybe the market has softened year over year. Who knows? This could be a non-recurring event here in the middle of September. Not aware of anything there. So maybe that's not anything I need to be worried about. But that immediately draws my attention, right? That difference between current position and last year's bookings. Other series can help, of course. Lots of people like to use comp sets. We can also use general market data. For the product in Wheelhouse for in context chart, in the top right up here, you have some options for preset choices. You can always build out your own views too. So if you wanted to create your own very specific view for this chart, you can do that. For now, I'm just going to use some of these out of the box ones. I'm going to use the set aggregate option. I'm going to zoom in because we have a year's worth of comp set data. And what's nice about this is now we've brought in a series here where it shows the 25th to 75th percentile range for the comp set. I've gone and made this ahead of time, by the way. So sorry, I should have mentioned that. This set isn't by default going to be there. You'll want to use the sets tool to create your own specific comp sets or neighborhood sets. It could be even a whole market set. You can really choose how you want to go about creating your set. In this case, I created more of a neighborhood set for this property. I see the median price and the range. And now I'm just going to compare these two, right? I can very clearly see that I'm almost always above the median price for my set. There are some dates where I'm dipping below, probably on weekdays, but for the most part, I'm definitely in that upper range, especially on my weekend peaks. I'm much higher in the early spring than the comp set, and much, much higher than the comp set in middle of July. So maybe that's an event that my competitors haven't picked up on that I have, and I want to keep my eyes on that. I may see the comp set follow, especially if they're not using dynamic pricing and they're starting to get booked out and they lag behind and catch up. I would keep my eyes on that. But I can very clearly see that this listing I'm pricing in the higher end of my set, right?
You have 12
And
minutes left, Keegan.
yeah, so that's a good option. We also have a built-in market view too. And this is going to be a broader market, right? So not very specific comp set. This is free to use, so the market will just be there for you, but it is our defined market set, which you can use in a similar fashion. But of course, there'll be more listings. You can see that pricing range is a lot lower than the comp set because I was specific with that. In this case, let's talk about setting levers. If I'm using the market as my gauge and I'm not getting booked for this property and I know I'm well above the market all the way across the calendar, my base price is going to be a good option to bring myself down to be more in line with that market. Because the base price functionally moves everything up or down. In this situation, if I'm not doing well with this property, I would probably just lower the base price to go and set to be more in line, right? So I like this, looks a little bit better. I probably do more fine tuning than just doing that, but very quick and easy lever to see how you can pull and change there. There's a couple more things I want to go into, but I think we are getting short on time. I want John to be able to kind of dive into the portfolio level stuff. This is really cool. So I'm gonna cut myself off there and let John take over.
I think the thing to remember on the individual listing is, again, there's a lot of comparisons, but what you want to remember here is when you go to the individual listing level, you're getting a broad view. You get to see the entire rate plan, so you're changing things foundationally. So while some people do very granular revenue management from that viewpoint, you can use it to just change specific dates. A lot of the time, what you're doing is you're pulling that up to get an idea of how is my rate plan set overall? Do I need to make changes? And you do that by looking for discrepancies between your comparison. So how does your current rate plan compare to how you booked last year? How does your current rate plan compare to how you're booking this year? How does last year compare to how you're booking this year? How do you compare to the market? How do you compare to a comp set? You're looking for those mismatches and trying to make a decision. Do I want to change my overall rate plan? Do I want to change any specific days? Am I okay with what's happening? It's a very good tool to use if you're going to say, like, in that segment part, if on a monthly basis you go and want to review at a deep level your underperformers. You find the stuff that has the lowest occupancy over the last 90 or 180 days, go in and just review the whole rate plans, right? So as you think of these steps, you do want to kind of link them. Obviously, new booking analysis is pretty linked to expiring inventory. Expiring inventory has elements of sorting and segments because you can kind of automate those things you pull up. As you create new sorting and segments, you may decide, hey, based on what I am trying to identify in this segment or this sort, do I go and do a deep dive and do some listing level analysis? Do I make changes specifically on the portfolio calendar? And you can start to construct a process that you could just follow on a weekly basis. This next piece that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to go through it pretty quick, is called the portfolio level analysis. So this is going to be much more effective if you have some scale in your portfolio. There are still use cases if you don't have a lot of listings. If you're a smaller user, you're probably going to do more listing level analysis in terms of your revenue management because you have to take past performance and extrapolate forward. Once you get a number of units in the same area in your portfolio, you can start to actually extrapolate demand between units. So you can see, hey, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3 are all booked on the same day. I have 3 more units. Can I actually push the rate on that? The way we're going to do that is we're going to go to this performance page. And when I pull that up, it's going to look like this. We have this graph here, and this is the main graph we're going to use. I usually suggest that you do this once a week. I'm going to first select a KPI Generally, I select occupancy. We know that the property's rates are going to be probably different among your portfolio, but there's always the same number of days in a month for every listing. So that's something consistent. And a lot of the time, I recommend using either adjusted occupancy, or if you have lots of blocks on your portfolio or multi-unit listings, you may use like a booked nights analysis, which is just the numerator instead of the denominator. Now, just to give you an idea of what's going on in this chart, we have the stayed on KPI for every month currently. So in January, there's 23% occupancy on the books to stay in January. And then I also have a highlight. So that highlight is set to 14 nights right now. What that's saying is of that 23% occupancy that's on the books, 7% was booked in the last 14 days. So already you get a view of the entire calendar for your KPI. You also get a highlight for your pacing. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this to daily. When I switch this to daily, the reason is it becomes basically a visualization of the entire tape chart for whatever group of listing you're looking at. So while on the expiring inventory, we were actually just making those decisions visually, now you can kind of see it. So when I look at this, you can see I have a lot of booking in the last 2 weeks. I'm actually going to switch this to a week. We have a lot of booking in the short term, right? So this was last week. We didn't hit a very high occupancy, but we got a lot of booking. As we come into the weekend, it's looking pretty good over New Year's, but this Christmas weekend is still, and Christmas week is still lagging a little bit. So I already know that I have some room for expiring inventory there. It's going to shape my decision. If I just doubled this, I'm not going to reach 100%, so I'm not on track to sell out. I can just see that visually. It does take some practice, but already when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, well, maybe I need to be much deeper in my expiring inventory because I'm just not selling out these dates. If I wanted to, I could go back in time just to see if that trend is consistent. So if I change the dates in the upper right, I can see, well, I really was reaching sellout. It's only once I hit December that I started to not reach sellout. So maybe I need to be much more conservative. And maybe I'll decide to push that forward. I know a lot of the properties in this portfolio are in low season in January. So maybe I need to be even more conservative through January because I've started reaching a point where I'm not selling out the portfolio anymore, right? Now, the other things you can look for are dates where you're seeing lots of sales. I'm going to switch this back to 14 nights so maybe we can see some. So you can see I have some sales out here in April. I have some sales out here in May. That's already just telling me to glance that maybe I want to go look at those dates on the calendar. Maybe I want to see what units are selling. If that sales is out of the ordinary, it's maybe an indicator for me that I have an opportunity to increase my rate. This chart here is something that does take some practice, but you'll start to notice certain shapes. Obviously, short line bad, tall line good for the most part in the short term is going to be useful, but you can start to see these patterns both in your sales and in your overall occupancy, and that's going to determine what changes you make. Now, when I pull this up, I will often also just pull up the portfolio calendar because I will mark down dates. It's like, okay, well, over the next week, I'm going to be shorter. I'm going to probably cut January a little bit. Maybe I'm going to look at this April time period and increase it. And I'm going to correlate that directly to the calendar. And that's how I'm going to make changes. Starting out, I'm probably making changes in the 10% range up and down. You don't want to go too crazy. It's also very important as you're first starting out that any major changes you make, you write a note for. You can keep those notes in the system if you want and add them here along with a reminder. Or something that we used to do a lot before the technology was as powerful as it was, is just put a reminder on your Google Calendar to go check a certain date range and group of properties, right? And that way you don't accidentally raise the rate, forget about it, and then find yourself unbooked as you get into the expiring inventory window. Now, there's a few other things you can do here that I would recommend. The first is all of your filters are going to be available on this page from the portfolio calendar. And while it's useful to look at the overall portfolio, you usually want to go to another level of detail in order to make decisions. Because I know in this portfolio, I actually have multiple markets and the demand in one market isn't the same as the demand in another. So I want to separate those out and look at them separately. I may also know that my booking windows are different for my different properties. My 1 bedrooms tend to book shorter. My 2 bedrooms tend to book further out. My 5 bedrooms book super far out. So I may want to look at those separately as well. And let's just take a look at this. So right now I'm going to go ahead and look at Savannah. We'll let this load real quick. And you can see that this chart looks quite a bit different. I'm actually very, very booked up for Christmas. And when I was looking at the portfolio, I was thinking, well, I'm going to cut Christmas probably quite a bit because I'm not booking. I'm not going to do that in Savannah. I might actually raise the rate because I only have a few room nights left to book in this market. Now, if I compare that to looking at, say, Nashville, we'll see if that is the same trend. So as I look at Nashville, again, a different trend. I'm not quite highly occupied, but my sales are super high here. So maybe I'm not actually going to cut the rate at all here. I might even decide to increase it a little because while I'm not sold out, I'm on track to sell out. That means in this portfolio somewhere, there's a market that's not on track to sell out. And that would be my goal to find, because if the overall says I'm not on track to sell this out, that means somewhere in this portfolio, a market is doing really, really bad if these other two markets seem to be doing really well. So those are the kind of things that you want to look at as you go through your list of listings. Generally, what I suggest is once a week, pull this up, start at the portfolio level, then go by market, then go by bedroom count, and just on a notepad, record the dates and time frames that you think should go up or down, and then go and make changes on the calendar. The reason I suggest pulling this calendar up and looking at them here is because you get a further level of differentiation. You'll be able to make decisions about what rate you want to do. You may decide to leave properties out or to make slight differences, where at the portfolio level, you might decide, I'm going to drop the rate 15% here. When you actually look at the listings, you might go, well, all these listings, I'm going to drop 15%, but I have some listings that have super low occupancy or haven't sold in a while. I'm going to drop them 25%, right? So you can get more and more granular. The key here is pulling this up once a week. It'll probably take you no more than an hour, depending on how big and complicated your portfolio is. In many cases, it may take as low as 30 minutes, but you'll have an idea of what's going on in your portfolio all the time. And we're looking at this in low season. Once we start hitting the booking window for high season, it's extremely helpful for you to be able to see and optimize dates that start booking early. So right now we're looking at New Orleans. Right here, this is the Super Bowl. I know in this portfolio that I've been watching this. I've been increasing the rate on this September because I was able to see that we were making bookings here. If you're only looking 30 days in advance on the calendar, you're going to miss when big events like this are really outpacing what you would expect. I can also see that there's an event here, February 20th to 21st. I don't know what's going on there, but it seems to be selling really early. So that might be another opportunity. Pull up those dates, try to increase the rate, see if sales continue to come in. We're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to show you one more piece here, but I'm not going to go into it. This is all just based on your current pace, but you do have the ability to pull up where you were last year as well. This market's not going to be a good one because the property didn't exist last year in the portfolio. Let me pull up a different one. But you can pull up this same data for your historicals as well. So now in green, this is where I was as of this time last year. So you can see, even though my occupancy is on track to sell out during the holidays, I'm doing much better than last year, and I'm selling way more. It's probably at a lower rate, honestly. You can also see that while this date range is much lower here, I'm pacing way behind. I'm pacing way ahead on this date range. So maybe an event moved. And then you can see I've got some early pace on a few dates, but a few dates aren't. So now you have that extra level of comparison to help you make a decision. Because when you look at something, you're like, man, I'm just not occupied as well as I want. You can look at last year and say, well, am I on track to do better or worse than last year? And that'll help you make a decision on how you change your rate. So that's a pretty quick overview on this. We have some more in-depth videos on how to do this, as well as some educational content that's really based around this kind of revenue management, which you can expect from us in 2025. But hopefully that was helpful for you. And we'll give you some ideas about how to use the platform.
Thanks everyone for joining. And just as a reminder, the recording will be sent out tomorrow, so you will have that in your inbox along with some other materials.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.